Have you ever found yourself obsessing over someone who just doesn't feel the same way about you? Maybe you're hung up on an ex that you can't seem to get over, or you're infatuated with a friend or co-worker who sees you as just a buddy. Whatever the situation, being emotionally attached to someone who doesn't reciprocate those feelings is a soul-crushing, miserable experience. In our society's barrage of romantic movies and saccharine love songs, we're constantly fed the idea that if we just pursue that special someone hard enough and prove our undying devotion, they'll ultimately realize we were the one all along. But the harsh truth is, sometimes people simply move on, feelings change, or that magical spark just isn't there. No amount of chasing or pining will reignite it. It's a difficult reality to accept when our hearts are stubbornly fixated on an unrequited desire. We tenaciously cling to that fantasy, desperately hoping against hope that this time will be different. Yet by doing so, we only perpetuate our own anguish and suffering. Thankfully, the ancient Stoic philosophers had profound insights into the nature of unhealthy attachments and obsessions. By examining their timeless principles of detachment, we can find wisdom to release ourselves from these emotional prisons and rediscover inner peace. So brace yourself as we delve into 12 powerful Stoic strategies to break the cycle of fixation and obsession over those who don't want us. It won't be easy, but the path to rational detachment is well worth the journey. Before we start, let me tell you that I appreciate you taking the time to watch this video, and I hope you will enjoy it. If this is your first visit, don't forget to leave a like. And if you find these insights helpful, please subscribe and hit the bell to be notified first of our newest releases. Desire causes suffering. In the wise words of Epictetus, there is only one way to happiness, and that is to cease worrying about things which are beyond the power of our will. The core idea here is that our desires and attachments to external things we cannot control are the root cause of our suffering. When we obsess over someone who doesn't want us back, we are craving and clinging to something outside our reasoned choice. No matter how intensely we want it, we cannot force them to reciprocate our feelings. Their emotions are beyond our control. Yet we torture ourselves endlessly pursuing this unattainable desire. We become enslaved by our fixation, constantly thinking about them, replaying memories, dreaming up scenarios where they finally see us for the catch we are. Our happiness becomes horribly intertwined with something we have no power over. The Stoics knew this was a recipe for misery. By wanting something so intensely that is outside our control, we inevitably breed anxiety, resentment, anger, despair, and suffering within ourselves. The more we obsess and crave their love, the more we're engulfed in turmoil when it's withheld. The alternative, according to the Stoics, is to reorient our desires inwardly towards the things we can control: our own thoughts, judgments, and actions. If we stop craving and clinging to someone else's affections that we cannot control, we take away the source of anguish. We may still feel disappointment, but it passes rather than festers into a debilitating obsession. It's an incredibly difficult practice, especially when our emotions stubbornly latch onto what we want. But the first step towards detachment is recognizing that many of our turbulent feelings stem from misplaced desires outside our own reasoned will. With this awareness, we can start letting go. Disillusionment is natural. The Roman emperor and philosopher Marcus Aurelius warned that everything we hear is an opinion, not a fact. Everything we see is a perspective, not the truth. When we're infatuated with someone, we tend to build them up in our minds as perfection personified. We ignore flaws, faults, and red flags, projecting idealized traits and qualities onto them that may not accurately align with reality. Our obsessive desire distorts our perception, blinding us to who they truly are as a human being. But the reality is, our rosy view of them is colored by our own cravings and emotional fixations. We see what we desperately want to see, not what is actually there. The Stoics understood that this disillusionment was an inevitable part of the process towards rational detachment. As Epictetus explained, when we are struck by envy, we should realize that the reasons lie in us, never in external objects. Our emotional turmoil originates from our own irrational perceptions and value judgments, not the person themselves. Once we start peeling back the layers of our idealized projections, we can see their humanness. They have personal flaws, bad habits, annoying quirks, and areas of emotional immaturity, just like everybody else. While not necessarily bad things, these realizations can be brutal gut punches that shatter the perfection fantasies we've constructed in our minds. It's a difficult disillusionment to confront. Part of us will cling tenaciously to the fairy tale perception we've created, rationalizing away or overlooking anything contradictory. We may lash out in anger, double down harder on the obsession, or plunge into despair. But the Stoics would advise leaning into this disillusionment, allowing ourselves to see this person's true nature without our hoped-for fantasies coloring our vision. Only then can we make a reasoned choice about whether continuing to obsess over them serves us, or inevitably leads to more suffering. Look at the big picture. Seneca reminded us that he robs present ills of their power who has perceived their coming beforehand. In other words, we can reduce the intensity of our fixations and obsessions by zooming out and looking at the bigger picture. When we're laser-focused on someone, it's easy to lose perspective on how relatively insignificant this desire truly is in the grand scheme of life. Our narrow fixation makes it feel like the most important thing in the world. But is it really? In the context of our entire lifespan, this obsession will likely be a blip. A temporary fixation that felt all-consuming in the heat of the moment, but ultimately faded into insignificance over the long run. Decades from now, will we really look back and lament over the person we spent months or years obsessing over? Probably not. The Stoics would encourage us to take a step back and think about where this unhealthy attachment fits into our core values and life priorities. Is it really in line with living a virtuous, ethical life full of reason and wisdom? Or is it driven by superficial lust, cravings, and the need to have our egos stroked? They'd urge us to consider the opportunity cost as well. How much of our finite time, energy, and mental space is being squandered on this obsession over someone else, rather than invested in more meaningful long-term pursuits? Are we missing out on other potential relationships, experiences, and personal growth by being so singularly fixated? Most of all, the Stoics knew that our obsessions and fixations, as intensely felt as they may be in the present moment, are inherently impermanent and fleeting. This storm of emotions shall eventually pass, as all temporal things must. The only question is whether we let it needlessly consume us now, or detach from the maelstrom with rational perspective. By zooming out and looking at our fixations through this wider lens, we can ideally lessen their felt intensity and urgency. The present obsession begins to feel less like an all-encompassing priority and more like a passing whim that our highest selves need not indulge. Don't force away feelings. If you resist anything in life, you will be eternally imprisoned by it. Epictetus. One of the biggest mistakes people make when trying to detach is forcibly suppressing their feelings and obsessive thoughts. We tell ourselves, "I just need to get over this," or "I can't think about them anymore." And so we try to shove those emotions down through sheer force of will, gritting our teeth and muscling through the angst. But as the Stoics knew, this resistance only breeds more suffering. The more we push away and fight against our feelings of desire, longing and rumination, the more we amplify their power over us. We get lost in fruitless inner battles, wasting precious energy wrestling with compulsive thoughts we cannot eliminate through brute force alone. The Stoic path is one of acceptance rather than suppression. We cannot selectively numb ourselves to our obsessive thoughts and fixations. Trying to do so only fuels them further. Instead, we must make peace with the fact that these longings will inevitably arise within our minds and learn to experience them with equanimity. Rather than furiously batting away each obsessive thought as it bubbles up, we allow ourselves to feel it fully while resisting the urge to latch onto it. We observe the rise and fall of emotions with curiosity, not judging or following them down inescapable rabbit holes. Thoughts and feelings come and they go. We need not assign them weighty importance. Over time, this process of allowing our fixations to move through us rather than fighting them actually helps diminish their intensity. When we aren't resisting so fiercely, our thoughts don't entrench themselves in never-ending cycles. We create space to experience passing emotions for what they are, temporary storylines that hold no binding reality unless we choose to cling to them. Detachment isn't forcing thoughts from our minds through willpower alone. It's becoming a conscious witness to the constant stream of arising and passing mental chatter, keeping our sense of perspective so we don't get endlessly drawn back into obsessive hamster wheels. Practice negative visualization. Begin each day by telling yourself, "Today I shall be meeting with interference, ingratitude, insolence, disloyalty, ill will and selfishness." Marcus Aurelius. This may sound like a terribly pessimistic way to start your morning, but the Stoics prescribe this form of negative visualization as a way to prepare our minds for life's inevitable misfortunes and disappointments. Rather than craving that everything always goes our way, we proactively envision obstacles and setbacks so we're less attached to flawlessly positive outcomes. On the surface, this feels counterintuitive to detaching from obsessive fixations over someone. Shouldn't we be visualizing our ideal scenario where they finally reciprocate our feelings, where we live happily ever after in unwavering bliss? But the Stoics knew these indulged fantasies only breed more unhealthy attachment. By envisioning our deepest desires perfectly fulfilled, we amplify our cravings and multiply the anguish when reality inevitably doesn't conform. We set ourselves up for a harder emotional crash from lofty heights of expectation. Instead, they'd advise visualizing all the ways our fixation could realistically disappoint us. Really lean into imaging the object of our obsession, rejecting us for the 1,000th time, or leaving us for someone else entirely. Ponder how it would feel if they outright mocked and humiliated our feelings for them. Envision navigating life alone while they're permanently off living theirs. Dark, for sure. Painful, absolutely. But the entire point is to intentionally spiral down into our deepest insecurities around this obsession, to get ahead of our fears and face them head-on rather than avoiding them, to prepare ourselves mentally for potentially catastrophic romantic outcomes that would normally shatter our world. Once we've explored the terrifying depths of how badly we could be hurt and disappointed, we become less attached to the relationship going perfectly. The fantasy shatters into insignificance, not because it's no longer wanted, but because we've confronted the possibility of losing it altogether, and found the strength to endure. We detach from obsessively needing that desired outcome. You've made it to the halfway point of the video. If you're enjoying the content, don't forget to like the video. And if you would like to see more, please subscribe and hit the notification bell. Your support means a lot. And lastly, leaving a comment really boosts this video and my channel. If you're not sure what to say, just type Stoic mode, so I know you made it this far. Now let's dive back into the video. Practice objectivity towards yourself. In the morning, when you are getting up, remind yourself whether you want to be upright or indifferent. Marcus Aurelius. We spend so much time analyzing the object of our fixation and obsession through an objective philosophical lens. But the Stoics would remind us to also practice this same objectivity inwards, to step outside ourselves and examine the root motivations, fears, and irrational belief systems that drive us to become so unhealthily attached in the first place. Why do we obsess over some people, yet feel indifferent towards others who might seem objectively just as suitable romantic partners? What core insecurities and emotional voids are we trying to fill or compensate for through this fixation? How much of the idealization and pedestaling stems from our own psychological projections rather than reality? By shining the light of self-inquiry inwards, we can unearth some uncomfortable truths about the genuine sources of our obsessive attachments. Perhaps we latch onto emotionally unavailable people as a subconscious way to feel the familiar anguish of parental abandonment in our childhood. Or we only become fixated on those who seem a higher status as a way to overcompensate for deep insecurities around our own self-worth. The Stoics didn't view these self-examination as judgments, but simply an exercise in seeing ourselves as we authentically are through the lens of reason. Once we've objectively assessed the irrational core beliefs and unmet needs fueling the obsession, we create space to have compassion for ourselves. These fixations weren't our choice, but psychological mechanisms developed to protect us. From this self-aware stance, we can decide if we want to continue indulging those patterns or cultivate more rational perspectives and healthier coping mechanisms to meet those underlying needs in better ways. The obsession slowly drains its power over us once its origins have been exposed to the light of objective consciousness. Of course, this level of self-examination isn't easy. Our fixations can prompt strong resistance to looking inward out of fear of what unflattering truths we may uncover about ourselves. But as the Stoics knew, the path to inner freedom starts with having the courage to objectively examine our own role in co-creating the prisons of the mind that keep us trapped in obsessive anguish. Imagine losing them. Make the prospect of death a mere relaxation and release from the ills of sense. Epictetus. I know, imagining the literal death of the person you desire sounds morbid. But hear me out. The Stoics didn't mean for us to dwell on this in an unhealthy, obsessive way. Rather, they advocated using this visualization as a philosophical exercise to cultivate perspective and detachment. The purpose behind this thought experiment is to vividly confront the impermanence of our fixations in the most extreme sense. To shatter the illusion that this person can ever be a permanent, lasting source of fulfillment in our lives. For whether we lose them to literal death or just the ending of a relationship, the anguish of having them as an all-consuming obsession is ultimately the same. By meditating on their mortality, on the inevitability that we will one day be separated from them, we take away their limiting power over us in the present moment. We realize that no matter how intensely we obsess and attach ourselves to them, that attachment is impermanent. Our desperate cravings to possess them spring from a false perception of permanence that does not exist. Once we've emotionally gone through the full experience of losing them, our fixation weakens its grip. We may still appreciate and even love the person dearly, but our attachment is no longer intertwined with our sense of existence and identity in an unhealthy, obsessive way. An inner separation has occurred where we can be with or without them while maintaining equanimity. Of course, this loss meditation needs to be practiced from a rational state of mind. Simply becoming depressed over morosely imagining their death is not the point. That's just a projection of our fears rather than philosophic contemplation. We are meant to allow the feeling of loss to arise and pass through us with conscious detachment. It's incredibly difficult to truly envision and accept, but an important part of the process of unhanding our grip on these fixations that cause us so much suffering. Only by coming to terms with loss can we extract ourselves from unhealthy obsession. Care, but not too much. Not to be angry with someone or dislike them, but simply guard yourself against their errors is a sign of true reason. Epictetus. The Stoics didn't advocate for callously detaching from all human relationships and connections. They realized that a certain degree of care and compassion towards others was important for living an ethical, virtuous life. However, they also knew that care taken to an excessive, obsessive degree was ultimately unhealthy and irrational. When we become overly emotionally invested and attached to how any single person views or treats us, we surrender our inner peace to forces outside our control. The goal, according to the Stoics, was to relate to others from a balanced, centered place, to be able to appreciate and cherish those in our lives, while maintaining a philosophy of skinless detachment, where their thoughts and actions don't shake us at our core. It's the difference between saying, "I value this person's role in my life and care for their well-being," versus, "I need this person's acceptance and affection to feel whole." One is an authentic connection without insecurity. The other is an unhealthy obsession stemming from deeper voids within ourselves. The Stoics would encourage having compassion for those we care about and their struggles, while avoiding judgment. But that compassion must be contained. We cannot allow ourselves to be jerked around emotionally based on their rational or irrational behaviors. We've all seen the destructive obsession that comes from caring too much about what a romantic interest thinks of us. We contort ourselves endlessly trying to impress them, dejected over any perceived slight or distance, our moods becoming utterly bound to the whims of this other person. This, the Stoics would say, is the origin of much unhappiness and suffering. By over-investing our sense of self-worth into something we cannot control, we inevitably open ourselves to anguish. The answer is to care, genuinely and rationally, while avoiding unhealthy over-attachment. Focus only on what you can control. The chief task in life is simply this: to identify and separate matters so that I can say clearly to myself which are externals not under my control and which have to do with the choices I actually control. Epictetus. One of the core principles of Stoicism is distinguishing between what is within our control and what is not, then obsessing less over what we cannot influence, and refocusing that energy on what we can. When we're fixated on someone, a huge amount of our mental bandwidth becomes consumed with factors entirely outside our own reasoned choice. We ruminate endlessly over their thoughts, feelings, motivations, and actions towards us, none of which we have any direct power over. We replay agonizing scenarios in our minds of them rejecting us, losing interest, or becoming intimate with someone else, torturing ourselves with events that may or may not come to pass. Meanwhile, we neglect tending to the aspects of our lives we can actually control in the present moment. The Stoics would urge us to draw a firm metaphorical line in our minds between their bubble of sovereignty over their existence and our sphere of influence over our own reasoned judgments and behaviors. Whatever happens in their world is ultimately up to them as an autonomous human being. It is hubris to believe we can control their emotions or decisions through our desperate obsessive attachment. Our fixation and control simply ends at consciously choosing our own intentional response to whatever they do or don't do. We cannot control their feelings towards us, but we can control how much importance we assign to those feelings. We cannot force them to reciprocate our desires, but we can pivot our desires elsewhere. We cannot compel them to treat us a certain way, but we can choose how much meaning we give to their treatment of us. By relentlessly examining what is truly in our control regarding the object of our fixation, we remove so much of the mental anguish that comes from obsessing over factors we cannot impact. Their piece of the equation becomes a neutral external event to which we rationally respond, rather than something to desperately ruminate over. Of course, this philosophical approach isn't meant to remove our humanness or feelings altogether. The Stoics understood there would still be pangs of sadness, disappointment or loss when we don't get what we want from someone. But our suffering is radically reduced when we confine ourselves only to what is in our control, our intentional responses in the present moment. Everything else is merely an external observation to make peace with, not something to pour our obsessive attachments into endlessly. Analyze them objectively. Men are disturbed not by things, but by the view they take of them. Epictetus. Why is it that we get so caught up obsessing over certain people, while we can easily detach from others? The Stoics would point to the irrational value judgments we place on particular individuals over others. When we become fixated on someone, there is often an underlying subconscious belief that this person possesses some rare, almost supernatural qualities that make them irreplaceably special compared to every other human on earth. We've elevated them to idol status in our minds. From this lofty pedestal, their thoughts, actions and feelings towards us take on extreme importance. A kind glance or flirtatious comment gets analyzed and overanalyzed for hidden meaning. A cold shoulder or lack of reciprocal interest plunges us into crisis. Our emotional well-being becomes irrationally tethered to someone we've assigned godlike powers over our psyche. The Stoics would advise taking a step back and analyzing the person as the ordinary human being they are, just like any other. Strip away the fantasies and projections. Dispassionately look at the concrete facts about who they are, their behaviors, their stated values and priorities in life, their circle of friends and family. You may realize there's nothing particularly extraordinary or unique about them at all. They're just a regular person with their own mix of hopes, struggles, flaws and limitations, not the infallible, perfect demigod you've obsessively built them up to be in your mind's eye. By objectively seeing someone for their simple, unremarkable human essence, you drain away much of the unhealthy pedestal you've put them on. Their ability to control your emotional state through intermittent reinforcement and attention loses power. You can start relating to them with rational impartiality rather than being jerked around by fantasy narratives in your head. This philosophical reversal of placing someone back into an ordinary mortal existence is crucial for detachment. Only once we've removed the unrealistic judgments and stories that feed the obsession can we break free of it. Practice is required. If you want to improve, be satisfied to be thought stupid and illiterate. Epictetus. The ideas of Stoicism seem simple enough on the surface, but putting them into consistent practice is anything but easy. Mastering the art of detachment and diffusing our obsessive fixations takes diligent, ongoing effort. You're not going to go from obsessively attached to totally detached overnight. There will be periods of startling clarity and rational perspective, followed by inevitable backslides into old thought patterns and cravings. Obsessions have deep emotional roots that don't get dislodged through a few philosophical exercises. The critical thing is to not beat yourself up over failures and lapses. That's only going to breed more negativity and resistance around the process. When you find yourself spiraling back into fixation, don't judge it. Objectively observe it with equanimity. Allow the emotions and thoughts to rise and fall without perpetuating them. Then in the calm moments, recommit to practicing detachment principles. Visualize the impermanence of your obsession. Analyze your irrational, obsessive thoughts with sobering logic. Zoom out to the bigger picture perspective. Have compassion for yourself as you'd have for anyone working through a dysfunctional pattern. Each time you catch yourself obsessing and consciously decide to detach and refocus, it's like a mental rep. The more you intentionally practice, the more it becomes automatic over time. What once felt impossible eventually becomes effortless second nature. As Epictetus warned, you also have to be willing to feel stupid, silly, or irrational in the process. Friends and family may not understand why you're purposefully confronting dark scenarios about your fixation fading, or why you're journaling endlessly about the most minute philosophical insights around detachment. But who cares what others think? This journey is about disentangling yourself from unhealthy obsessions, not impressing others with personal growth performances. Free yourself from that external locus of judging your practice as well. The road to detachment is arduous, with many stumbles and course corrections, but with diligent, non-judgmental practice over time, you too can master this vital Stoic craft. This too shall pass. Time is a river of never-ending flow. Marcus Aurelius. No matter how intense your feelings seem in the present moment, they will eventually lose their grip. The Stoics knew that by keeping an eternal perspective, even the most turbulent emotions and fixations were only passing storms. Think about past obsessions and infatuations you once thought would consume you forever. Maybe it was a high school crush you silly obsessed over for years, or an ex you swore you could never live without. Whatever it was, that all-encompassing fixation at some point faded into a blip on your life's journey. Not because you forced it away through willpower or made grandiose, profound breakthroughs, but simply because you gave it the permanent impermanence of time and perspective to run its natural course. One day, almost inexplicably, you just moved on. The intensity of that fixation dissipated like a temporary fever, never to return. That's the funny thing about obsessive emotions. They thrive on our present moment fixation, but are inherently unsustainable. Our interests and passions ebb and flow as naturally as breathing. No mental fixation, no matter how grand, can realistically maintain that fever pitch forever. The Stoics would remind us that our feelings in any given moment, no matter how vividly real they seem, are just temporary perspectives influenced by our current thoughts and circumstances. Our reasons and motivations shift day to day, so that former fixation inevitably loses its luster. While excruciating in the throes of it, the obsession was merely a passing storyline, not an eternal truth. By staying tapped into this eternal perspective, we create detachment from the desperation of any given fixation. We gain patience to ride out the intensity until it naturally diffuses over time, Instead of fueling it with obsessive energy, we witness it rising and falling like ocean waves from the indelible bedrock of our highest selves. Conclusion. So there you have it. 12 timeless Stoic strategies to help you emotionally detach from those unhealthy obsessions and fixations that cause so much suffering. I know from personal experience how gut-wrenching and all-consuming these emotional attachments can feel when you're deep in the throes of them. It seems almost impossible to imagine breaking their grip over your psyche. But the enlightening truth is that no obsession, no fixation on any single person or desired outcome is permanent or worth sacrificing our inner peace. The Stoics show us how to cultivate the rational perspective and psychological tools to loosen these attachments and reclaim our freedom. Of course, none of this is about becoming a cold, emotionally repressed person. Quite the opposite. The Stoics realize there is virtue in forming caring bonds and feeling our emotions authentically. But they also saw the critical wisdom in not being enslaved by obsessive fixations that inevitably lead to suffering. The path is to be able to genuinely appreciate people in our lives while being emotionally unhooked from an unhealthy need for their attention, affection, or reciprocation. To relate to others from a balanced, centered place of compassion and reason, not irrational obsession. Mastering this detached perspective takes diligent practice. It's an ongoing process of objectively witnessing our fixations, projections, and false narratives without judging them. Of zooming out to gain perspective on their impermanence in the bigger picture of life's journey. It's a difficult road, no doubt. There will be stumbles, backslides, and moments where old attachments flare up again. But persist with the practice, have self-compassion, and you'll eventually experience the profound inner freedom that comes with Stoic detachment. Have you had to detach from an unhealthy obsession or fixation? What Stoic strategies helped you get through it? Share your experiences in the comments below. And if you want to dive deeper into practical Stoic philosophy, be sure to check out the other videos appearing on your screen or delve into one of the many videos on our homepage.